you, Scotty. Thank you all for allowing me to be here. You are taking him away from meeting with businesses today, and it's much more fun to talk about Ruby Pickens Tartt. I realized when I was preparing this, you're celebrating the 30th anniversary of Food for Thought. Well, I'm celebrating my 30th year of knowing Miss Ruby. I was introduced to her as a junior at the University of West Alabama, then Livingston University, when I was asked to actually typeset this book, Dim Roads and Dark Nights by Dr. Alan Brown. And so he was my reason for getting to know Miss Ruby, and I continue to thank him every day for that introduction. So as I would type every word that he had written, I would read her stories, and I became more and more fascinated by her. So when I went to the University of Southern Mississippi, and I was asked, what do you want to do your dissertation on? I said, Miss Ruby Pickens Tartt. And they said, who? And so I began to tell them. Luckily, my chair of my committee was a man whose wife's father had been the Methodist minister in Livingston in the 1950s. And ironically enough, Miss Tartt gave them a silver loving cup upon their marriage, and he visited her in the nursing home while he was working on a dissertation from Vanderbilt on New Orleans poets. And so when I presented him with my abstract, he said, Tina, if I had known the person I was talking to in that nursing home, you would be not writing this dissertation, it would have already been written. And so I felt like I had his blessing at that point. But my topic is Ruby Pickens Tartt, Composing a New Score. I chose that title simply because I think she was rewriting, and music becomes such a part of her life that she writes a new way for looking at herself and a new way to exist in a town and in a community in which they weren't always sure what to do with her. And so this picture here is actually taken, it was ran as her obituary, with her obituary, but this was taken near her death in 1974, and the year before her death, when they asked what she wanted for her birthday, she wanted to see all of her paintings in one room again. And so at the Presbyterian Church on that birthday, over 150 paintings were gathered for her to look over. Now, of course, for some reason, no one ever documented those paintings. So if any of you have any paintings, please let me know, because I continue to document those. But who was Miss Ruby? She was a fifth-generation Sumter Countyan, and she was part of a family who had prominence. She actually was a relative of the first native-born governor, Andrew Pickens of Alabama, and she was born to devoted parents of William King Pickens and Fannie West Short Pickens. You see her name is Ruby Stewart, and she was born in 1880, the first year that Julia Tutwiler came to Livingston to head up Livingston Female Academy. And she was the sister of Champ Pickens, so they were very close family, and this was pictured on their home. Their home no longer exists in Livingston. One of the things you should know about her is she was educated at Livingston Female Academy under Tutwiler. And when I say that she was from a loving home and her father really cared for her, he catered to her every desire while the income lasted. In fact, she had one of the first automobiles in Sumter County. They installed a gas tank in the front yard so that she could fuel up. They even had a mechanic from Mobile. And I am told that you simply got out of her way when she was driving in the county. And of course, you're going to see in a little bit the recording device that she carried in the trunk when she and Lomax were on their hunts. But she was influenced by many people, and it is that identity of painter that a lot of times I give people as an introduction, because she was not trained in music, she was not trained as a writer. She did receive training as a painter, and that identity as a painter or someone who paints or artistic is something that stays with her, and she self-identifies herself as that. If you noticed before, her name is Ruby Stewart Pickens, and her mother was Fannie West Short Pickens. Her grandmother, Mary Champ, was an art teacher at Livingston Female Academy, that then becomes, of course, University of West Alabama. And she names both of these women for famous American artists. Gilbert Stuart, who, of course, painted Washington's portrait that a lot of us recognize as kind of that unfinished portrait, and one of the first American painters, Benjamin West. The other person person who really influences her and kind of encourages her to think outside the box, if you will, and not be afraid of what people may think because you do things a little bit differently, is Julia Tutwiler. Miss Tartt, one of the stories I always get, and I always kind of look over my shoulder since I've been with her for about 30 years now, is that there are two ideas of thought. You really loved her, or you got out of her way because you weren't really sure which side of the fence you were going to fall. She had definite opinions about things, and so her grandmother at the age of 6 took her to meet Julia Tutwiler because she thought that painting might be a way to calm her and to kind of let her express herself. And so Tutwiler, as you know, was an advocate, and they mentioned the Alabama women, their lives and times, and there's a wonderful chapter on Julia Tutwiler in that book. And she really becomes a friend to Tartt. In fact, she will hire Tartt back after Tartt goes to Sophie Newcomb College. She hires Tartt to run the art department, and Tartt returns to Livingston to run the art department in 1900 and become the art teacher there. But Tartt was always one to kind of wander and come back home. Sumter County always drew her back, whether it was for financial reasons or just because one of the things that she loved there were the people, and she wanted to record their stories and their music. But before she returned home to do some of those things, even though she had been doing a little bit all of her life, she traveled to New York and she studied art under William Merritt Chase, and she studied photography, and that's one of the things a lot of people don't realize, under Arnold Ginthe. And both of those men have a big influence on her because she really gets involved in portraiture. And if you read her work, you're going to see, especially her folk stories, especially her stories, her ex-slave narratives, they're not just interviews that she's doing. She's capturing portraits of individuals. And she uses those techniques that she learns in paintings to really create a picture, not only of herself, but of the people that she is documenting. And so the landscape comes into focus. So, for example, the painting that you see here is one of her paintings that she considers her black belt paintings. And she always puts the African American community typically in the forefront, and they're walking towards something, and typically they're walking towards home or they're walking towards church. And as I drove over here, it was raining, but as I got further along, if you really look at the colors right now, she captures the colors of the black belt very well, and light and sky. But those same words and those same ways that she's capturing slice of life, sky, water, and even the way that she describes the scenes as she rides to homes in which she is going to do recording, she documents all of that. And so the same qualities of her art training would be how she enters into the world of writing and song collecting. This is a portrait of actually an unnamed individual. We're not sure. This is in the collection of the Stewart family in Livingston. And you'll again see that soft focus, muted colors. But if you look at the eyes, the person's treated and they're looking directly back at you. And if you look at her ex-slave narratives, or if you listen to the voices and the eyes are always looking at you. When does Tartt discover or start working with music? Again, she did this in her entire life. In fact, if you go back and look, her father is the one who introduces her, and when she is a child, they go, and as she's listening to people sing, he tells her to take it down. In fact, there was one African-American man named Mr. Coleman, and she would repeat the songs he was singing. Her father would stop her and say, "You don't have it right. Go back and talk with Mr. Coleman and listen to his voice. You need to capture the voice." And so when the Depression hit, even though she had come from a prominent family, her father had lost his fortune in 1917 due to the boll weevil crisis that came through Alabama. And then she married into the Tartt family, who was the banking family in town. She and her husband, however, their fortune is a little bit different from the rest of the family. Although all the other family I can show where they owned a home, she and her husband never owned a home. One great niece actually told me that she said, we never really knew. She kind of gave things away. If you look at the way their life goes, their homes get smaller and smaller. In fact, her last home was a duplex apartment owned by a great nephew before she moves into the nursing home. And money really didn't seem to mean a whole lot to them, And so she just kind of led a little bit of a different life than the rest of the family. However, she did discover when the Depression hit, as she said in this, I discovered overnight we had no money, no jobs, we were in debt, and it seems incredible that Pratt and I had saved nothing. Never in my life had I heard of a bill mentioned, because her father had taken care of those. And where I thought money came from, I really wasn't sure. At that particular time, her husband, Mr. Pratt, and I don't really know the story behind this. I was talking to a great nephew last week, and we were laughing. He said, Uncle Pratt one day walked out of the bank and never went back. And so we know he worked for the post office for a while. The town loved him. He played Santa Claus at Christmas. He was a very quiet man, but really at that particular point there really wasn't support, and so she went to work for the WPA. What she did at the WPA, of course, she was hired to head up a sewing project in York, Alabama. But Miss Tartt never ever really did anything she was told she was supposed to do. And so even though she was hired to oversee a sewing project, and she was a fabulous seamstress, in fact there's a great niece in Sumter County, and she has pieces of a doll trousseau that her Aunt Ruby sewed for her, and it included a fur coat, pajamas, an evening gown, bedding, everything for this doll that Miss Ruby sewed for her. But instead of sewing, the women who were part of that sewing project, Miss Tartt, of course, saw that they loved to sing and tell stories when they were working. It was a way to pass the time. So instead of sewing, Miss Tartt would get her recorder out and her pen and paper out, and she would write down the songs. And she would write the stories, or she would tell them, I've heard of this particular song. Can you sing it for me so I can record it? She sent those in, and in fact was almost being fired from the sewing project because they weren't getting their projects done. And she transfers to the Federal Writers Project, and she starts sending her material to Birmingham to a lady named Myrtle Miles. She and Miss Miles did not get along. There's lots of letters in which she kind of says Miles doesn't appreciate what she's hearing and everything else. And so she's actually finally able to do some of the lifelong collection of her work. And the picture that you see there is actually taken by Ruby Terrell Lomax when they are in Sumter County in 1939. This is part of the 1939 recording trip, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But something happens. John Lomax, who had in 1934 published the American Ballads of Folk Songs, comes and has been appointed the head of the Federal Writers Project in 1936. He had made a trip to Alabama in 1934, and most of us know of his work of discovering blues singers, and in Texas he had done cowboy songs, and he had used the format of going into prisons because he felt like in the prisons that was where he was going to get kind of the pure voice, the undiscovered voice. And he attempted to do that in 1934 in Alabama. He came away and said, Alabama is a musical wasteland. That was his summation. He wasn't going to go back to Alabama. But he picked up a stack of manuscripts in 1936, and he called down to Birmingham to Miss Miles and said, who is this woman, Ruby Pickens Tartt? There is no way that one person has collected all of these songs. It's just impossible. They're all different. He got on the phone with Miss Ruby, asked her where she had collected them from, and realized that she had collected all those songs within 15 miles of Livingston, Alabama. Again, he was incredulous and said, there's no way. I'm coming down. So as we celebrate our bicentennial, the years 1937 and 1939 are really significant in the history of Ruby Pickens Tartt, because in 1937 and 1939 are two recording trips that John Lomax makes to Alabama. He makes a third one in 1941, in which he works with Miss Ruby Pickens Tartt. And at that particular time, particularly in 1939, they collected over 350 folk songs that now are housed in the Library of Congress. And we have that there. Of course, that's the back of the car, and that is the recording device that they would drive up to and record you if you were one of the people they were visiting. Now, what happens, and you see the different ones, in 1940 they did 204 songs, from October 25th to November 4th. And I see Joey Breitner here, and so you can imagine, Joey, how much they were recording in those few days. Some of them were actually made with them driving out to people's homes, driving to African-American churches throughout the countryside of Livingston and Sumter County, but also to, at that particular time, Miss Tartt lived in a home called Baldwin Hill. It still exists. It's just across the Sumter River between Livingston and York, Alabama, and you can still visit if Miss Lucy Gallman invites you in to the veranda and to the dining room where those recordings took place. And it's really interesting to go there and imagine them recording those songs. It sits adjacent to the Sumter River, and so the field hollers that you hear are actually being recorded across the river. And so it's really interesting to go back and listen to those songs. There's a young woman at the University of Virginia right now. Her name is Alana Dye, and she is actually working on a dissertation on women song collectors, and Miss Ruby is one of them. And they were all from this time period doing work with the WPA and the Federal Writers Project. She's landed on Miss Ruby because Miss Ruby is the only one of the ones that she has found that has no musical training. And so the ironic thing about Miss Ruby's collection is it is just words along with the music. There are no musical notations because she did not know how to do that. And so we were talking just last week when she was in Livingston, and we said, what was the experience and what was different between Lomax's experience and Tartt's experience? And then what happened when the two got together? Well, I think what really happened when the two got together is with the women, we were thinking about, it was really about relationships. And the reason that we were able to really see the difference of, and you look at the amount of material that Miss Ruby knew every one of these individuals. She had grown up with, they had grown up, they knew the families were connected to each other in some way. And so Lomax was coming into a community as a stranger. And so she becomes kind of that middle ground. And so sometimes when some people ask, why do we not know as much about Miss Ruby? Well, one of the statements that she made about her work was that this work was not about her. She becomes an instrument through which this work gets to be heard. And those were her words. And so that's one of the reasons with composing a new score, and this reference to that, is she saw herself as that instrument in which we could tap into a community that maybe had not been heard before. And so these are some of the people that she recorded. This is by no means all of them. You see Enoch Brown. I referred to the hollers. That is what he was known for, call and response and hollers. Mr. Brown was very shy, and it was very rare to capture him in pictures, and so this is the one photograph that we have. The photographs that are square with the numbers on them, you can all see them if you'll go to the Library of Congress and go to the John and Ruby Lomax collection. This is all part of the 1939 trip, and there are lots of photographs to go over and enjoy. There also is field notes from that trip, which are extremely interesting to go through and listen to and read. Hetty Godfrey is up there. She sang. Also, Joe and Molly McDonald and their daughter. There's also families that are being recorded singing together. And Joe and Molly McDonald and their family were actually recorded at their home. Hetty Godfrey at Baldwin Hill. And then Harriet McClintock with her children. And she actually collected her story, and so she's one of the ex-slave narratives that she collected. Probably in the middle and on the upper, Doc Reed and Vera Hall are the most well-known of the ones that were collected from, and they become kind of the refrain that you hear over and over again when you hear Ruby Pickens Tartt mentioned. And so Doc Reed becomes a very close companion, and he's one of the ones and the reasons that I think about music becomes a way that they communicate with each other. They use music to talk across boundaries and to talk among themselves about things that maybe they weren't allowed to talk about as a white woman and a black man. They're able to share experiences with each other that probably would not have been allowed or would have been frowned upon in their communities. And I'll show you those in just a second. Doc Reed only sang spirituals. Vera Hall was his cousin, and we know her probably best for some of her songs like Another Man Done Gone. and also ox blues that she sings. In a recording, you get Hall saying that she doesn't know any blues because she did not want her cousin Dot to know that she knew those railroad songs or blues songs. And so after the fact, when they recorded the two of them together, John Lomax and Miss Ruby in particular said, Vera, will you come back later? She's also, her first name is actually Adele, so Vera Adele Ward Hall is how you actually see her listed sometimes. And so she did. And when she came back, that is when they got Another Man Done Gone and some of those blues for which we know her. And as it says up there, in one trip alone, they sang more than 19 spirituals together. Doc Reed has this really deep voice. And then up in the top, I've just shown you another collector, Byron Arnold, who came through in the 1940s. He records Hall and Reed again with the help of Miss Ruby. And then, of course, this is the album that I'm talking about with the others. So Lomax becomes this constant encourager. He tells her, you are a star, a bright, refulgent star among a lot of duds. And what he was referring to is he's like, I can't believe the rest of the community is not as excited as you are about what you are doing. But again, the community saw her as a painter, and as she said to Catherine Tucker Windham, when they became friends in the 1960s, and she was working on a book called One Big Front Porch, and she and Miss Ruby became really good friends, started corresponding with each other because they were very kind of like-minded. And she said, well, wasn't anybody else interested in what you were doing? And she said, no. According to public opinion, I was nuts, and I was almost alone in my interest. And so a lot of times it was just kind of seen as, that's what Miss Ruby does. Just leave her alone, and it'll be okay. And she'll come back in a little while when we are doing it. Now, great nieces and nephews thought she was a lot of fun because of all the stories and stuff that she told. This is actually Lomax and Harriet McClintock. And when the WPA ends and the writing career begins, and what I mean by that is that John Lomax, once the WPA job is over, John Lomax encourages Ruby Pickens Tartt to continue to write. And so he asks her to retrieve her things. He gets her work back from Library of Congress so that she can work on a book. He gets her to write short stories based on her work. One of those is A Pair of Blue Stockings, and it's about Alice and Josh Horn. And so she gets published in Alabama Sketches and Southwest Review. She gets published in 1945 in the Best Short Stories of America, right alongside Ernest Hemingway and others. And unfortunately, in 1945, a tornado hits, destroys the home that she is living in, crushes her right arm, which is her painting arm, and she develops palsy in that, and the book is never written. She continues to write. Her manuscripts are really hard to read. She continues to record. She continues to paint. And in fact, painting is something, and she talks about the pain she's in when she's writing or she's painting because she wants to express herself in some way. And to show you the relationship that she had with the family and the communities in which she recorded, two of the stories that I have about that is when she's in the hospital with her arm, Josh Horn visits her. And he had heard that Miss Ruby was in financial trouble. Josh Horn, one of the families that she recorded, and I have his book here. His great-granddaughter has now published a book called Josh Horn and Ruby Pickens Tartt, An Unlikely Alliance. You know this book. And it is a wonderful story. And Mr. Horn had 16 children. And upon his death, he bequeathed 360 acres to his children that he owned. And she recorded his story and Miss Alice's story. She also helped them save their land when somebody kind of tried to take it away from them by rewriting a will. And he went to her and said, read this will for me. And she said, this will not do. And she rewrites the will. And one of his daughters, who also was in college, read it and said, this is the will that we are going to sign. And so they were able to keep their land, and they still have it. And Mrs. Lawson talks about that relationship between the two individuals of Josh Horn and Miss Ruby. So Josh visits Miss Ruby and in the hospital, and he presents her with money because he wants her to take care of her hospital bill. And so they have this really, really special relationship. Similarly with Doc Reed, when Miss Ruby's father dies, she is truly one of those Southern girls who was a daddy's girl. Mom and Miss Ruby, sometimes not. But Daddy and Miss Ruby were she was a daddy's girl. And so when he died, she was very upset. Doc Reed comes to her and he starts singing a song, and they start sharing a musical together, and said, basically he wouldn't want you to be sad. Basically, he would not want you to mourn. And so the song that they sing, hold on one second, is Angel flew from the bottom of the pit, gathered the sun in all of her fist, gathered the wind all around her waist, crying, Holy Lord, weep like a willow, moan like a dove, you can't get to heaven, thou you go by love. And he was reminding her that her father loved him, and said, and it's the same song that later in John Lomax's Ballad Hunter that he would record of Reed, and Reed is upset about Lomax's death. He would never hear about him, and Miss Ruby brings him Ballad Hunter, and in fact, she brings him this very book, because this was Miss Ruby's Ballad Hunter copy. This is hers. And in it is a letter to Miss Ruby from John Lomax. And so it was a gift to me from the family, and I'm very proud to own it. But she reads him the poem because there's a chapter dedicated to Doc Reed. And at the end, when they sing the song, he said, I can't get satisfied. And at the end, when they share the song together, he said, I'm satisfied. And so they're able to use music as a way to come together as a common language and share. Miss Ruby is going to pass away before Doc Reed. And out of the blue, he steps forward at her funeral, and he sings the song, Still Away Home. There is a recording of this that the family has, and they still play it sometimes because it was completely out of the blue. And if you read the words of Still Away Home, and you listen to what it says, it's almost as he says to her, and it's a call and response in will. My Lord, he calls me by thunder. The trumpet sounds within my soul. I ain't got long to stay now. And so he's okay with her going home because he knows that he will be joining her soon, and they will be together again to do what they like to do, which is share music with one another. The story of her with the singers is intertwined. In recent years, probably the group that is most intertwined is Vera Hall and Miss Ruby. It's been a wonderful part of my last few years of working with Miss Daisy Bell Quinney and Jody Tartt, both of whom are from Sumter County. Miss Daisy Bell Quinney is from Panola, Alabama. Jody Tartt is from Livingston, and she is a great niece of Miss Ruby. In fact, she was 5 when Miss Ruby died, and she's still angry at her parents for not letting her go to her funeral. And so, because she loved Doc Reed and knew him, and so when she found the recording, she's the one who plays it all the time. But in recent years, Jody is an English teacher at the Demopolis High School. She's also into the arts and head of their fine arts department. Miss Daisy Bell Quinney is a Dana trained artistic teacher, and she also does one-woman shows. She moved from Panola, went up to Pennsylvania, became an ordained minister, and also rediscovered the stories of Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and started portraying those women in woman shows. So when she moved back to the county about 12 years ago, we ran into each other and we were talking, and I asked her to come and do one of her shows, and afterwards I met with her and I said, so why are you not doing Vera Hall or Mariah Faring, two wonderful ladies in Sumter County who are just inspirational stories? And she said, well, I don't know them. And so it made us realize that we needed to be telling the stories of Vera Hall and Miss Ruby and others from our county. And so they have gotten together, and this is actually Miss Vera and Miss Ruby sitting down to tea in the future, kind of laughing that people still talk about them and listen to their music and their stories. And this is a show that we put on together called An Evening with Miss Ruby and Vera. And we've taken it, and we've also done a version of this in which we use a choir, and we teach children the songs that they sang, and they do vignettes together, and they reenact the stories that Miss Ruby wrote down. And Miss Daisy Bell Quinney has done several shows in which she becomes Miss Vera, and she sings the songs, but she also talks to you as if she is Vera Hall. And so that we were doing this for the Alabama Folklife Association in Livingston. So what did these women achieve? Ruby Pickens Tartt was Mary Louise and Stars Fell on Alabama. As I said, that book was by Carl Carmer, and other people are going to write, and Miss Ruby's going to be a character in those books. She is that in Harold Corlander's book. She is Miss Judy. She was published in the Best Short Stories of 1945. A Pair of Blue Stockings, which Jody Tartt still wants to put on as a short play. She recorded Vera Hall, who's up in that upper corner of Another Man Done Gone. And in reality, there's about 700 songs if we add up all the different trips that are actually part of the Library of Congress. She's a member of the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame and the Black Belt Hall of Fame. She's a member of the Alabama Library Association's Hall of Fame. And then Vera Hall, her partner in music, performed at the American Music Festival at Columbia University. Her recordings were used by the BBC to introduce folk music to Britain, particularly blues. She is the main character in Alan Lomax's Rainbow Sign, but she's known as Norah. And why is she still around, and what are people? It's really wonderful. In 2000, techno artist, 1999 I guess, Moby rediscovered her and her recordings. And so if you listen to his album play, Trouble So Hard is there, and the soundtracks are underneath it. Since then, other artists have rediscovered her and have started inserting her songs. There's a young man who's a blues saxophonist. His name is Dan Kaplan. He is, as he calls himself, I'm a good Jewish boy from New York who now teaches blues music in Texas. He has 2 albums, one of which is dedicated to Vera Hall. He said she is the reason I love music. And she was inducted into the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame and the Black Belt Hall of Fame as well. And so both of these women's legacies continue to live. Tartt was that middle ground, as I said. She was this metaphorical, how can I connect people to the larger story? And so once the Lomaxes hit, people start coming into Sumter County. And again, when I talk to people in Livingston, particularly her great nieces and nephews who are still living, they said, it was kind of weird. All these people would just stop by and gravitate towards Aunt Ruby. We never knew who was actually going to be at her different houses. And some of those are B.A. Bodkin, Carl Carmer, John Lomax, Ely Siegmeister, Harold Corlander, Alan Lomax, Julia Peterkin, and of course Catherine Tucker Windham. And all of those individuals spend time in Livingston, talk, but it's amazing when you go and you look at some of the dedications of their book, particularly Carl Carmer. If you read the introduction to his book that was published in 1934, because he's one of the first that come, and he actually makes his way to Sumter County via Tartt's daughter. She's in school at the University of Alabama, and she gets into an organization called the Blackfriar Club, and she invites them to spend the weekend in Sumter County. Carl Carmer is their teacher, so he comes and stays. He and Miss Ruby sit up late and start talking and telling stories. He asks about different things in the county, and so she starts talking to him about superstitions and folklore and telling him stories that she had learned. She started singing some of the songs, and he said, "You need to write a book." And she said, "No, I can't write. I'll have one foot in the grave before that ever happens." And she said, "You're going to write the book." And so if you really look through and you read the book very carefully, and you'll see in Howell Rain's introduction as well, that it's Miss Ruby who brings that stuff, particularly from that area of Alabama, to him. And so that's why that book exists. And he credits her with that. And he actually writes an essay that was supposed to appear in Reader's Digest, but it never did. And it was called My Most Unforgettable Character. And that was, of course, Miss Ruby. On her writing herself, again, she did not consider herself a writer. She considers herself a painter. The dogwoods that you see there is actually a piece of hand-painted china She did, as I said, she attended Sophie Newcomb College. At Sophie Newcomb College, she learned to make pottery. We actually have on our campus a piece of, it's a tea set that she did for Julia Tutwiler. And supposedly it was Julia Tutwiler's favorite tea set, and she had her tea in that every morning. And but she made it while she was at Sophie Newcomb College. And so this is a plate that she painted and fired. But about her writing, she said it certainly wasn't the nature of the beast. But she did what she had to do, one, to earn money, but two, she did it how she wanted to. So as she said with her paintings, she wanted her peach to have fuzz and her grapes to look juicy. And one day, when somebody asked her, she had a rash on her chin and somebody was at her house, and they said, "What happened?" And she said, "Oh, my peaches scratched me." And so she always wanted that with her own writing too, as she described herself. And when they asked about her voice and the way what she was doing and collecting the music, and the length, she said, it wasn't that I was trying to capture anything. It was the appropriate language that I wanted to use. And in 1980, when her biographers, Virginia Pounds Brown, and Lorella Owens wrote the book, Toting the Lead Row, and I was fortunate enough to know both of the women. And we were talking about their work. If you look at Toting the Lead Row and you read the ex-slave narratives that are in there, you'll notice that the dialect has been removed. They were very upset by that, but that was a decision of the editorial department at that particular time because they thought the dialect was too difficult for people to read. But if you actually read it that way, and then compare it to Gabriel Blow-Soft, which was published in 1997 by Dr. Alan Brown, and he restores the dialect. Something's missing. With Gabriel Blow-Soft, again, you get to hear if you read it out loud, you hear the voices of the people in which she was recording. Even if she recorded herself, sometimes you would hear her write. She wrote phonetically what she heard because she wanted that person's language to be captured. So, in Harold Corlander's book, he has Rich Amerson, the character of Rich Amerson, or Richard Creeks, talk about Miss Judy, which is Miss Ruby. And in it, he talks about her habit. And basically her habit is that he says, Miss Judy goes and she goes out to churches and she goes to people's homes and she writes them down. She did it with her dad, and so I guess it just became some kind of habit. And Miss Ruby took that on as kind of a mantle when she saw that book, and she said, yes, I'm doing my habit today. And so she had a habit of breaking barriers. And when she was elected into the Alabama Library Association Hall of Fame, James A. Hand wrote that generation gaps, status, religion, regionalism, educational, racial segregation, none of these conditional barriers bound her spirit because she was always looking for something else. Alan Lomax, who helped nominate her to the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame, and just as a little tidbit, of course, this is the 50th anniversary of his big trip to Alabama. Miss Ruby's daughter goes and lives with him for a while, and of course Vera Hall goes to New York and lives with him. But Miss Ruby gets upset with him, so for about 25 years they do not talk. She refuses to talk to him because she doesn't think some of the ways he records people is correct. And so in the letter it goes on and he talks about, even though we weren't talking, he really appreciates everything that she did. And so here's what he writes about her. Without her, a generation of black geniuses who have made life in this country so much more livable and more beautiful by their wit and their music would have been lost to us. And it goes on to say that without her, we would never have discovered this rich treasure of folk songs in Alabama. And so he does really credit her with that, even though, as I said, for about 20 years they did not talk. They did mend right before her death. And when finally she talks about her relationship with music, with language, with painting, and with actually working in the African American community, you see that she writes, I've been particularly interested not only in what he said, but the way he said it. His own words, for I believe we can better understand a person if we know the very language in which he expresses his thoughts and feelings. If I have succeeded in that, I'm satisfied. And about individual songs, and when you talk about her, some people say, well, I wish I would have had the music so I can play it or I can do that. Again, she was after the words. She was composing a new score. So she made this analogy about folk music. She said it's like a folk music, if you think about it as a flower, and the stem of it is actually the words. Every time somebody sings it in their own voice, or they do it their own way, we all become part of that common stem, and we all join it. So, and in some way, again, we're all painting on a canvas, whether it's music, whether it's the written page, or where we're actually painting with paint. And so she wanted to capture the individuals and what they wanted to do. So she truly was that instrument through which we were able to learn about others. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a few questions. Just remind you, we are recording this, so if you'll wait until we get the microphone so we can get your question on audio as well. Any questions?
I don't have a question, but I was just going to, I don't have a question, but I was going to mention something. That Aunt Ruby's husband, Pratt, was my great uncle. And I lived here in Montgomery. We called her Aunt Ruby. Quite a woman. Very, very strong-willed, great artist. And one of the things that I might mention about Aunt Ruby, in the early 40s, there was a tornado that hit Livingston and destroyed their home, and they were inside at the time. Broke both of Aunt Ruby's arms because she was an artist. So she taught herself how to paint with her hands and her toes. Her brother was Champ Pickens. Champ Pickens was quite a promoter of sports. If those of you who are familiar with the blue-gray football game that was played here in Montgomery, he developed the blue-gray football game. One other little note about Champ Pickens, I kind of feel like he's got a little bit with me being here today. He was a promoter of sports, and he had a baseball team in Livingston, Alabama. It was a semi-pro team. My father played baseball at Auburn, but the baseball team in Livingston was full of Alabama players. So he recruited my father to come to Livingston to play baseball. So the first day he showed up for baseball practice, people normally played first base, and he walked up, and they already had a first baseman. So this gentleman introduces himself. He said, "My name is Tom Tartt. I play first base." And my father said, "Well, my name is Frank Knowles, and I'm here to take your place." So not only did he take my uncle's place, but my uncle said not only did he take my place, but he married my sister. So if Champ Pickens hadn't recruited my father, I wouldn't be telling y'all any of this today. But Aunt Ruby was quite a lady. And I've certainly enjoyed your presentation. It's great. Oh, I might mention one other thing. When my wife and I got married in 1953, this was a present from Aunt Ruby. She painted it, but I've never seen anything like this before. Somehow or another, she got 2 Kodak pictures of my wife and I, and has our faces on the figures of the individuals there. But be happy to share it with anybody that would like to take a look at it. But that's an original Aunt Ruby painting.
And if you would like to see, there's one of those for somebody else. I think it may have been for Miss Fanny Pickens for her daughter, and we have it at the local library, which is named for her, something that I didn't really, she actually retired as our librarian, and we would not have a public library without her, because she's the one that argued for it and through a women's organization called the Primrose Club. And so we have her paintings and some drawings and stuff displayed there at the Ruby Pickens Tartt Library.
Great.
And
great.
Of course, we still have Tom Tartt as a mayor, just a different one.
Thank you.
Yes. Are any of these songs in some sort of format where we can hear them?
Yes, there's several ways. You can actually listen to them from the Library of Congress, and Joey, if you want to help me a little bit, there's some other recordings. In the 1990s, there was a collection called Deep River, Alabama, and that actually has a lot of those songs. You can still get your hands on the collection that Lomax's did or Harold Corlander did. But again, the Library of Congress is still probably the best repository for getting those songs. And even at the archives here, Kevin Nutt has run across a couple of recordings from Meridian, Mississippi that were made over there at Vera Hall. And so they also have songs here at the archives. Is that?
Yeah, for a while the Library of Congress had kind of a special section about the trip that Ruby Lomax made with her husband in Alabama. I don't know if that's still up.
It is still up, and if you just go to Library of Congress and actually in the search, if you'll put John and Ruby Lomax, that 1939 trip will come up in there, and so that's one of the easiest ways to locate the songs.
Any other questions?
Not a question. I loved your presentation. To me, I'm going to remember this Miss Ruby as the first feminist of Alabama.
She was a lot of, like I said, many of the great nieces have often told me that they felt like they had more in common with her than they did their mothers, and they felt more comfortable coming and talking to her than they did their mothers.
Did she ever know Joel Chandler Harris?
You know, I can't find any record where they met. There's another person I want to see if they met, and of course that's Zora Neale Hurston. They were collecting at the same time, and I know they both worked with Lomax. And one of my dissertation chairs was working on Hurston, and we can trace Hurston as far as Selma. And at the same time, Tartt's collecting, same years, and we're like, and Lomax was the linchpin, and we're like, we can't find any documentation that they know each other. And so if anybody ever runs across that, please let me know. But no, as far as Joel, he's a little bit earlier than her, and so I don't find anything of them. Mm-hmm.
Could you name the schools that she attended?
Yes, of course she attended what was Livingston Female Academy, and then at Alabama Normal College, and then she went to Sophie Newcomb College, and then she went up to New York and studied at William Merritt Chase's for a while. She was only there for about a year. And then if you actually lay out a timeline for Miss Ruby, what you discover is she comes back, she teaches in 1900 to 1901, she heads up to New York. She comes back and marries Pratt in 1904. They have their only daughter in 1906. And then there's this gap. And what I've been able to learn, and even in Phyllis's book about her great-grandfather, Josh Horn, and she confirms it, several other people, is Miss Ruby actually contracts TB. And so she goes out to Colorado and lives for 8 years. And there's actually some letters back and forth. Her daughter, Fanny, doesn't call her mom. She calls her woo-woo. And so there's pictures of her, not pictures literally, but like sketches that they're doing where she's going to visit woo-woo out west. And so she calls her grandmother mother, because during that time in her young life, she was raised by her grandmother and her grandfather. And then she returns. And so that's where she really does pick up some jewelry making out west. But those are the schools that she attended.
Got time for one more question right here.
I was curious to know what are the words to cornbread crumbled in gravy.
What now? What are the words?
Yeah.
I actually have that here. So if you would like to see it, I will share it with you.
Yeah, curious.
A great start to the 2019 series. Thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you in February.